Our first study in Latin 2 is about relative pronouns in Latin. In English, we would use relative pronouns like who, which, or that. I've given you some sample English sentences that all involve relative pronouns. The tray which the slaves carried is full of food. The slaves who carried the tray are strong. Aurelia, whom the slaves feared, was nervous. Cornelia, with whom we went to the forum, is a friend. The dinner guests whose cups were full enjoyed the dinner party. The butcher to whom mother gave money sold us a hare. The freedmen for whom we prepared dinner were happy. I've tried to give you a sample sentence from each of the 5 major cases that we've been working with. This is a chart that you need to be fluent in. This is a chart of all the Latin relative pronouns in their singular forms. If you notice, there are different pronouns for masculine words, there are pronouns for feminine words, and then there are pronouns for neuter words. This would be a good time to pause the video and capture this entire chart into your notes. Be sure to include the English translations. In the nominative case, a relative pronoun would be translated as who, or if you're referring to an object, which. In the genitive case, if you're referring to a person, you're going to say either whose or of whom. And if you're going to be referring back to an object, you would say of which. The dative forms are identical, as were the genitive forms. And the dative forms, if you're referring to a person, are to or for whom in their translation, or to or for which. In the accusative forms, you have these nice accusative endings that should be familiar. Neuter accusative is the same as that neuter nominative that's up there. And our accusative translation is exactly what you would expect it to be now that you are all experts in noun declensions. Verb or prep whom, verb or prep which. And finally, we have ablative relative pronouns for each gender, all with mandatory macrons. And the translation is exactly what you would expect. Sid space if wab whom, sid space if wab which. Some sample sentences for you. The freedman who is eating dinner is very happy. We have qui over here. The slave woman whom Aurelia was scolding is tired. The pig, the hooves of which are black, runs in the forum. The doctor whose patients ate dessert is good. The dining room in which the guests ate is very beautiful. Now we've come to the plural chart of all the relative pronouns. Again, I would suggest that you pause the video to make sure that you have enough time to write down all of the pronouns by masculine, feminine, and neuter. You'll find that the plural forms are very much like noun endings that you already know. E, I, aurum, aurum, aurum. The dative and the ablatives are all identical. And then the accusatives are what you would anticipate an accusative plural to be, with os, as, and then you have that neuter qui being repeated. Conveniently for you, the English translations of the plurals are identical to the English translations of the singular. In English, we don't make a differentiation between who as a singular versus who as a plural. Latin will make that determination, though, so you do need to make sure that you know all of the forms. Paying a little attention here to the English translations, I want you to notice that in all but nominative case, we usually see this word whom. In other words, whom will never be the subject of a sentence. This is an important takeaway for you as you're writing sentences and essays in English. Also, it's an important takeaway that when you have something like genitive, you should keep the of with whom instead of leaving of at the end of the sentence. Whom were you thinking of? You should ask instead, of whom were you thinking? Again, with the dative, to or for should stay with the whom, or to or for should stay with the which. To which city are you traveling? Instead of which city are you traveling to? These little prepositions should stay with the whom or the which. The accusative forms are identical, and of course, ablative falls into that same category we were just speaking of, in which the prepositions stay right next to either the whom or the which. I've given you the same sentences as before, only with plural forms, so that you can see how the English has not changed. The freedmen who are eating dinner are happy. So here's your plural, qui. The slave women whom Aurelia scolded are tired. Here's quas. The pigs, the hooves of which are black, are running in the forum. The doctors whose patients ate dessert are good. The dining rooms in which the guests ate are very beautiful. So again, the actual English sentences did not change with respect to their relative pronouns. They are identical in each of these situations. When you're in a sentence with a relative pronoun, there are two key concepts that you need to take notice of. The first one is the concept of the antecedent. The antecedent is a noun that appears earlier in the sentence that the relative pronoun refers back to. The noun referred to is the antecedent. And then we have a term called a relative clause. You might remember from your language arts background that a clause is a phrase of words that contains a verb or an action. The relative clause in a sentence contains the relative pronoun and, by default, some sort of verb or action. One very, very critical message for you to take away from this is that the antecedent and the relative pronoun within the clause may have different cases depending on how the pronoun is used within the clause. So now you might be thinking, well, golly, how on earth could I possibly choose the right pronoun if I don't know what case it's going to be? So which is this final section here. In order to choose the correct pronoun when you are asked to provide one, there's a pretty simple 3-step process. But the entire 3-step process is predicated on the idea that you have memorized all of the translations of all of the relative pronouns. That you can look at an accusative relative pronoun and know that there has to be a verb or a preposition in front of it. That you know that a genitive pronoun form like cuyos needs to be translated of which. So let's assume that you've memorized all your forms and all your translations. When you are asked to choose the pronoun, you are going to first use the English that's given to you to provide the context, and you're going to select the correct case. Then you're going to identify the gender and the number of the antecedent. Do not identify the case. The case will not help you. Afterwards, you will select the pronoun that is the right case for the clause and the right gender and the number for the antecedent. After you follow this short 3-step process, it should be easy to choose the correct pronoun. I have some examples for you. The slave woman whom Aurelia scolded was tired. The relative pronoun that you would need to provide in this sentence is whom. The relative clause is whom Aurelia scolded. And the antecedent, which is the word that the pronoun refers back to, is the slave woman. Whom, as a translation, is indicative of the accusative case. Since the antecedent is the slave woman, and the slave woman is Ancilla, then you're looking for a feminine, singular antecedent. Your antecedent is feminine and singular. You need an accusative case pronoun. If you add all those details up, you get quam. The dining room in which the guests ate is very beautiful. The relative pronoun in the sentence that you would need to provide is in which. The relative clause that embeds the pronoun as well as this verb is in which the guests ate. This in which refers back to the dining room, so the dining room becomes your antecedent. In translation form, in which is an ablative translation. The antecedent is the dining room. The word for dining room is triclinium, which is a neuter, singular noun. You go to your chart, you pick out your neuter, singular, ablative pronoun, and you end up with quo. The freedman who is eating dinner is happy. Who is eating dinner is the relative clause. The relative pronoun is who. The antecedent, the word that who refers back to, is the freedman. Who can only have a nominative translation, so that makes your job a little bit easier. The antecedent is freedman. The word for freedman is libertus, which is a masculine singular noun. So in order to create your pronoun, you need a masculine singular nominative pronoun. You need the pronoun qui. And finally, the chair which is in the atrium is tall. The relative pronoun that you need is which. The relative clause which is in the dining room. This relative pronoun which refers back to the chair. Which is a nominative translation. The antecedent we said was chair. The word for chair is sella, which is feminine and singular. So you need a feminine singular pronoun. You need the pronoun qui. Now this is a good opportunity to talk about the fact that all Latin nouns have some sort of gender. Just because you say which does not imply that you're referring to an object that is neuter. We're going to continue working on relative pronouns in the coming classes. I hope that this has given you a bit of a foundation on which to build some further class knowledge and activities.
Hello.